you still reach for your phone to tell them. It's been 2 years. The impulse arrives first. Not fresh grief, the grief that should have passed. The inner citadel. The inner citadel, midlife grief is summons, not sentence. What you carry is neurobiological, not character failure. In 2026, Neuroscience named the mechanism your body already knew. Seneca described it in 65 AD, Jung in 1913. This is philosophy, not therapy. Seek support if in crisis. 3 frameworks, 2,000 years apart, 1 exit. What if endless grief is not weakness, but misfiring? Your nucleus accumbens keeps searching for someone who cannot return. The same reward system as addiction. Craving reunion. A 2026 Trends in Neurosciences review confirmed the craving mechanism. Seneca described this interior logic in Letter 63, year 65. Jung mapped this from inside his own midlife descent. Professor Richard Bryant published the mechanism in 2026. Grief is reward and goal-oriented, he wrote. Your brain is not broken. It is catastrophically loyal. The nucleus accumbens shows elevated activity even years later. Yearning shows no correlation with time since the loss. Kubler-Ross wrote 5 stages for the dying, not bereaved. That model never explained why grief sometimes does not diminish. In 2022, DSM-5-TR added prolonged grief disorder officially. 1 in 10 bereaved carry acute grief for years. At midlife 40 to 50, grief exposure peaks. You may grieve a parent, a career, a self. What we found in this literature, a convergence nobody expected. Neuroscience, Jung, and Stoicism each map the same trap. All 3 point to 1 exit, measurable on fMRI. To understand the exit, you first need the neural level trap. Normal grief and prolonged grief are not the same animal. Normal grief, yearning diminishes as the bereaved accepts finality. Prolonged grief, yearning stays acute. The system never recalibrates. The conflict monitor anterior cingulate cortex goes offline. You cannot stop ruminating even when you consciously want to. The right amygdala becomes hyperactivated, specifically to loss stimuli. Intrusive thoughts, the amygdala fires before the prefrontal cortex responds. What struck us in 2026 was confirmation, not novelty. Seneca had described the same system without neuroscience vocabulary. I have had them as if I would lose them. I have lost them as if I have them still. That is phenomenology, the PGD reward loop described. When did grief stop following the schedule you expected? Research says something that changes how you judge yourself. Just process it. That response makes prolonged grief worse. The neuroscience of the exit reframes everything. What comes next? But first, one more piece of the neuroscience. Dr. Catherine Shear spent 3 decades at Columbia on this. Her complicated grief treatment, 16 weeks, 3 large NIMH-funded trials. If this resonates with what you carry, go deeper. CGT restores capacity to live alongside grief, not dissolve it. Erasure versus integration. The difference is everything. A woman in her late 40s, pattern we've seen. She lost her father, grieved and returned to her routines. 3 years later, yearning unchanged from the first week. The research says her terror was the rational response. She was not failing to grieve. She was grieving catastrophically. The brain's grief system worked when lost people came back. It was designed for temporary separation. Death is permanent. A 30-year Swedish study linked midlife losses to cognitive decline. Not to alarm, but this matters beyond mood. The sandwich generation peaks exactly at ages 45 to 54. Grieving a parent, raising children, holding an ill-fitting career. Jung wrote at 62, He was confessing, not theorizing. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. What to accept? The person the loss has made you. Jung's model is a century old, some things revised. Used as a lens, not a gospel. Precise. Neuroscience, Jung, and Stoicism are about to collide. What emerges changes not just understanding but carry. Neuroscience took until 2026. Jung felt this reversal first. What if your unending grief Jung called the Nigredo? The alchemical blackening. Matter must die before transmutation. Jung entered his Nigredo at the height of his career. He descended deliberately into his own psyche, 6 years. He drew, wept, wrote. He nearly lost grip on reality. What emerged became the most complete map of psychological transformation. Nigredo is not pathology. The entrance, darkness before gold. This framework helps. It does not replace a qualified therapist. Existential passage and clinical depression are different. Both deserve attention. You are not stuck. You are at an entrance. A passage that requires descent, not acceleration. The culture says, move faster, sleep better, push through. Jung's prescription, descend consciously or it pulls you down. What does that mean in practice? Seneca arrives here. Seneca wrote Letter 63 when his friend Flaccus just died. He was 68. He had outlived most people he loved. We may weep, but we must not wail. Precise difference. Weeping grief aloud. Wailing grief that has crossed into resistance. Resistance, Seneca argued, transforms ordinary grief into prolonged form. Letter 99, to a father who could not stop. Stop performing grief as if it changes the fact. Allowing grief fully without resistance lets it move. Here's where it becomes strange. Neuroscience now measures this. Cognitive reappraisal, reframing loss reduces amygdala reactivity. On fMRI, the amygdala, threat detector, literally calms. A 2026 study confirmed Stoic attitudes build resilience measurably. Cognitive reappraisal is precisely what Letter 63 was teaching. Not denial, not toxic positivity, not better place. The loss is real. It does not end meaning. I've lost them as if I have them still. Memory trained, the dead as continuing influences. Amor fati, love of fate, including loss. Not resignation. Accept what fate binds you to. Love what fate brings. The best grief map was written 2,000 years ago. Seneca wrote Letter 63 the day Flaccus died, not theory. We may weep, but we must not wail. Precise distinction. Grief aloud. Resistance, that is where the circuit locks. Cognitive reappraisal now shows measurable amygdala reduction on fMRI. 3 disciplines, 2,000 years. 1 mechanism, now the practice. 5 minutes, but only if you understand why it works. The nucleus accumbens cannot distinguish real reunion from imagined. Shear's CGT exploits this, the strongest evidence base. The practice, 7 stages. Today we cover the first 3. Tonight open whatever you write in, not a screen. Write one sentence. The grief I have been resisting is. Do not analyze it. Write the first sentence that arrives. What I fear losing by letting the grief move is. What are you protecting by not letting it move? Seneca called it our relationship to grief, not grief. One thing this person brought to my life was, that is the reappraisal move. Loss is real, meaning continues. Not 5 minutes of resolution, 5 minutes of direction. The nucleus accumbens cannot recalibrate fast, but receives a signal. The signal, this person existed. What they brought still exists. Jung called this carrying loss without being carried by it. Not erasure, not moving on. Integration is the real word. Moving on was always the wrong destination. A sober reckoning, everything you trusted collapsed in decades. The analog days to digital, grief carries that crossing. Your grief may be for a world, not a person. Individuation grief, mourning the self-transformation left behind. That grief is the cost of growing past yourself. Shadow work here is philosophical self-examination, not clinical intervention. If this destabilizes, bring it to a therapist. What we explore today has 7 layers. We've reached 3. Stages 4 through 7 include a Stoic grief meditation. Grief after 40 is not a failure state. Literature confirms. Seneca, Jung, and your brain all confirm a signal. The psyche is ready for midlife demands if you descend. What would you have done knowing grief was not failure? That question is worth sitting with those 3 sentences tonight. 7 stages. The complete practice goes deeper. Link below. Awakenings are not given once and held. They are practiced. Aurelius wrote the meditations as daily practice, not for others. Seneca wrote knowing he would die within the year, practicing. Jung wrote at 62. He was confessing, not theorizing. The inner citadel, a practice he returned to. When did grief stop following the schedule? Leave a comment. Next, Jung's albedo. Full breakdown pinned in the comments.